Hey guys, Lord Naren White here, the Holy Ghost, the one true God, back with you with the next video in my series reading Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Without further ado, returning to Oliver Twist as read by Lord Naren White. Chapter 17. Oliver's destiny, continuing unpropitious, brings a great man to London to injure his reputation. It is the custom on the stage, in all good murderous melodramas, to present the tragic and the comic scenes in as regular alternation as the layers of red and white in a side of streaky bacon. The hero sinks upon his straw bed, weighed down by fetters and misfortunes. In the next scene, his faithful but unconscious squire regales the audience with a comic song. We behold, with throbbing bosoms, the heroine in the grasp of a proud and ruthless baron, her virtue and her life alike in danger, drawing forth her dagger to preserve the one at the cost of the other. And just as our expectations are wrought up to the highest pitch, a whistle is heard, and we are straightway transported to the great hall of the castle, where a gray-headed seneschal sings a funny chorus, with a funnier body of vassals, who are free from all sorts of places, from church vaults to palaces, and roam about its company, caroling perpetually. Such changes appear absurd, but they are so unnatural as they would seem at first sight. The transitions in real life, from well-spread boards to deathbeds, and from mourning weeds to holiday garments, are not a whit less startling. Only there we are busy actors, instead of passive lookers-on, which makes a vast difference. The actors, in the mimic life of the theatre, are blind to violent transitions and abrupt impulses of passion or feeling, which, presented before the eyes of mere spectators, are at once condemned as outrageous and preposterous, as sudden shiftings of the scene and rapid changes of time and place are not only sanctioned in books by long usage, but are by many considered as the great art of authorship. An author's skill in his craft being, by such critics, chiefly estimated with relation to the dilemmas in which he leaves his characters at the end of every chapter, this brief introduction to the present one may perhaps be deemed unnecessary. If so, let it be considered a delicate intimation, on the part of the historian, that he is going back to the town in which Oliver Twist was born. The reader, taking it for granted that there are good and substantial reasons for making the journey, or he would not be invited to proceed upon such an expectation. Mr. Bumble emerged at early morning from the workhouse gate, and walked with portly carriage and commanding steps up the High Street. He was in the full bloom and pride of beetlehood. His cocked hat and coat were dazzling in the morning sun. He clutched his cane with the vigorous tenacity of health and power. Mr. Bumble always carried his head high, but this morning it was higher than usual. There was an abstraction in his eye, and an elevation in his air, which might have warned an observant stranger that thoughts were passing in the beadle's mind too great for utterance. Mr. Bumble stopped not to converse with the small shopkeepers and others who spoke to him deferentially as he passed along. He merely returned their salutations with a wave of his hand, and relaxed not in his dignified pace until he reached the farm where Mrs. Mann tended the infant paupers with parochial care. "Drat that beetle!" said Mrs. Mann, hearing the well-known shaking at the garden gate. "If it isn't him at this time in the morning. Lawk, Mr. Bumble, only think of its being you. Well, dear me, it is a pleasure, this is. Come into the parlor, sir, please." The first sentence was addressed to Susan, and the exclamations of delight were uttered to Mr. Bumble, as the good lady unlocked the garden gate and showed him with great attention and respect into the house. "Mrs. Mann," said Mr. Bumble, not sitting upon or dropping himself into a seat, as any common jackanapes would, but letting himself gradually and slowly down into a chair. "Mrs. Mann, ma'am, good morning." "Well, and good morning to you, sir," replied Mrs. Mann, with many smiles, "and hoping you find yourself well, sir." "So, Mrs. Mann," replied the beadle. "A parochial life is not a bed of roses, Mrs. Mann." "Ah, that it isn't, indeed, Mr. Bumble," rejoined the lady. All the infant paupers might have chorused the rejoinder with great propriety if they hadn't heard it. "A parochial life, ma'am," continued Mr. Bumble, striking the table with his cane, "is a life of worry and vexation and hardihood, but all the public characters, as I may say, must suffer prosecution." Mrs. Mann, not very well knowing what the beadle meant, raised her hands with a look of sympathy and sighed. "Ah, you may well sigh, Mrs. Mann," said the beadle. Finding she had done right, Mrs. Mann sighed again, evidently to the satisfaction of the public character, who, repressing a complacent smile by looking sternly at his cocked hat, said, "Mrs. Mann, I am going to London." "Lawk, Mr. Bumble!" cried Mrs. Mann, starting back. "To London, ma'am," resumed the inflexible beadle. "By coach, I and 2 paupers, Mrs. Mann. A legal action is a-coming on about a settlement, and the board has appointed me, Mrs. Mann, to dispose the matter before the quarter sessions at Clerkenwell. And I very much question," added Mr. Bumble, drawing himself up, "whether the Clerkenwell sessions will not find themselves in the wrong box before they have done with me." "Oh, you mustn't be too hard upon them," said Mrs. Mann, coaxingly. "The Clerkenwell sessions have brought it upon themselves, ma'am," replied Mr. Bumble. "And if the Clerkenwell sessions find that they come off rather worse than they expected, the Clerkenwell sessions have only themselves to thank." And there was so much determination and depth of purpose about the menacing manner in which Mr. Bumble delivered himself of these words, that Mrs. Mann appeared quite awed by them. At length she said, "You're going by coach, sir? I thought it was always usual to send them paupers in carts." "That's when they're ill, Mrs. Mann," said the beadle. "We put the sick paupers into open carts in the rainy weather, to prevent their taking cold." "Oh," said Mrs. Mann. "The opposition coach contracts for these 2, and takes them cheap," said Mr. Bumble. "They are both in a very low state, and we find it would come £2 cheaper to move 'em than to bury 'em, that is, if we can throw 'em upon another parish, which I think we shall be able to do, if they don't die upon the road to spite us. Ha, ha, ha!" When Mr. Bumble had laughed a little while, his eyes again encountered the cocked hat, and he became grave. "We are forgetting business, ma'am," said the beadle. "Here is your parochial stipend for the month." Mr. Bumble produced some silver money rolled up in paper from his pocket-book and requested a receipt, which Mrs. Mann wrote. "It's very much blotted, sir." said the farmer of infants. But it's formal enough, I dare say. Thank you, Mr. Bumble, sir. I'm very much obliged to you, I'm sure. Mr. Bumble nodded blandly in acknowledgment of Mrs. Mann's courtesy, and inquired how the children were. Bless their dear hearts, said Mrs. Mann with emotion. Bless their dear little hearts, said Mrs. Mann with emotion. They're as well as can be, the dears. Of course, except the two that died last week, and little Dick. Isn't that boy no better? Inquired Mr. Bumble. And we'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care, and thanks again.